I am so pleased to introduce our next guest, Lex Sokolin. He is a fintech futurist and he's a global fintech co-head at Consensus. I'm sorry about that. And he is here to talk about different technologies and how they've impacted the financial services industry and how that is going to impact consumers. Now, before I pass it off to Lex, I just want to remind everybody, if you're watching via YouTube, we'll be able to take questions from you at the end, but you got to type them out in your chat box. If you're watching via LinkedIn or Facebook, just type out what's on your mind and your questions in the chat box or in the comments, excuse me, and we will get to them at the end of Lex's presentation. Without further ado, Lex, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to walk through some of these ideas with the audience. I think we are constantly hearing that there's this expansion in financial technology, that Google is entering finance. There's the conversation about the East and the West. There's the conversation about artificial intelligence and virtual reality and all of these different things. And what I've tried to do is put together a framework that explains what's going on in a fairly approachable way, and then opens it up to what are the next platform shifts, like what is really happening in finance over the next 10 years, and bringing this together from an analyst point of view, a startup operator point of view, an investor point of view, and then really projecting towards some of the science fiction outcomes that can happen in this industry. I admit I have a slide problem, and so you will have the slide problem with me. It's my addiction, and I try to build a data-driven argument. And so I'll walk through a lot of data, and hopefully that'll give you many ideas for what is really going on and what's driving it. So the first thing we'll talk about is fintech, financial technology, and the progress to date that fintech has had on financial services, certainly companies that we all know and use and love. And so fintech there's always been technology in financial services, but fintech in particular is kind of a Silicon Valley customer first story, digital first story. And you can capture it in the paradigm shift that's happened in venture capital over the last decade and a half. So in 2007, about 5% of venture capital was going into finance. And now it's about 17%. If you look at public markets, about 20% of public markets are actually kind of the enterprise value is in financial services companies. So there's been this equilibrium shift where private investment has massively shifted into financial services to build Silicon Valley-like companies. On top of that, there's been a massive shift into private investment. So you can see the blue bars going from something like 50 billion to 200 billion over the last decade. And so that's created a massive tailwind. It's been really helpful for folks to start companies in financial services and technologies around financial services. As one more data point, think about GDP. About 15 to 20% of GDP is in finance. So again, it was really this correction of figuring out we can digitize and we can innovate in this sector. And the core kind of vector of innovation, at this point, this is kind of an old idea, was to take the bank experience and unbundle it into lots and lots of different features. And you can see all of these different companies trying to do investing and saving and trading and money movement and all the things that we expect from our financial companies. And what that has resulted in is these kind of vertical champions that are able to do some particular function, whether that is digital wealth and robo-investing, or whether that is banking and it's called neobanking, or whether that is digital lending through something like SoFi. And these companies have grown big consumer fintech brands. The next step has been to add on lots of different functionalities to that. So what in the past was unbundled has come back in and gotten rebundled. And of course, when we look at large financial institutions, of course, they're also in the same in the same journey, right? And we see lots of great financial institutions offering um, digital wealth and asset allocation and free trading, um, and various digital banking services and payment services and so on. And of course, I can include lots of logos in here. The last bit of the story is that the big tech, there's not a question of whether big tech companies are entering finance. They're already in finance. So Apple is in finance, Amazon is in finance, um, Facebook is in finance. All of these companies have found ways to integrate and offer financial services as part of what they do, even though regulations have made it fairly, uh, they've made it a bit labyrinthian for them to get there. But regardless, the large tech companies see financial services as a vector of competition. And so that's created a blurring of technology and finance, and it's created a blurring of these functions between I'm going to send a chat, I'm going to send a message, to I'm going to include a payment in that message, that very fast transaction between communication and payments, sort of same type of transaction. And then once you have money in motion, it starts turning into savings and accruing into an account, and starting to generate interest. And once you generate interest, you start thinking about, well, how can I borrow? How can I lend? Maybe I want to invest this. Maybe I want to trade this. What are the services that you add on top of that? And then you get to a place of thinking about retirement and 401ks and life insurance, right? And so this continuum, which is very regulated and very distinct in the traditional financial ecosystem, is completely blurred together in the technology and the fintech ecosystem, because there's no real reason from a software perspective these things should be separate. And so, of course, you have a blending of that within the software examples that I provide on the page. If you think more globally, the East and the West has an interesting dynamic at the moment, and I think the Eastern fintech companies have done an absolutely fantastic job of uh, building platforms for commercial activity. So whereas in the West, our high-tech firms are primarily media companies monetized through advertising with these adjacent services, in the East, you have fintech companies that are the platform where the commerce happens. So things like Ant Financial or WeChat or Paytm in India, they have leapfrogged in large part what we've been able to do in the US and in Europe by putting the financial experience within the operating system of essentially the phone. And these things are called super apps and are really interesting. As an example, Ant Financial is going to IPO at around 300 billion, I believe, owned largely by Alibaba. And that's it's important to understand that story and kind of what drives it. And now if you look at the US, how is the US trying to catch up? What are the vectors of catching up with this? I think you have to understand the type of commerce that exists inside of Shopify or Instagram, where we're starting to see platforms that are both capturing the audience that is doing the shopping and doing the commercial activity, and then embedding into that commercial activity financial features, whether those are payments or, for example, for Shopify to order bank accounts to the small merchants that live on the Shopify platform, and then aggregate them into a single app that lives on your phone. So again, we have this convergence now with American high tech trying to catch up with the models that have been built out in the East. This is called, as a vector, embedded finance. Lots of venture capitalists are excited about embedded finance. So this story is to point out that banking and the manufacturing of financial product has been hit pretty hard by COVID. I mean, if you look at sectors, the financial sector is not one that has done well. I mean, the one that has done well is largely the big tech companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on. And there's a lot of pressure around that, whether those are monopolies and what the regulation should be. But regardless, the sort of like the pure manufacturing of financial product that banks do has suffered in terms of enterprise value. And so the kind of the tech vector that gets us out of that is embedding banking product and investment product and payment product in the digital places where people live, right? So embedding insurance inside of travel website, embedding credit inside of shopping websites. And if you look at venture investment, folks make the argument that this is a 2 trillion type of opportunity that's equivalent to the entire software industry in the sense that it puts finance into the software experience, into where people live and work. Easy enough, easy stuff. And so that catches us up to where fintech is today, right? That's up to 2020. So the next question is like, well, what are the platform shifts that are difficult, that'll continue to change and challenge what we do? And one of those is to think about manufacturing. I talked about a lot of the transformation and distribution in terms of how finance products get to the customer. And there's all this stuff in the middle office that helps make things more efficient and do trading and rebalancing and underwriting. But it's the making of the financial instrument that's actually really hard. And it hasn't changed for decades and decades. A deposit account, a brokerage account, a payments network is largely the same for a long period of time. And so this is, if you listen to conversations around blockchains and digital assets and distributed ledgers, this is where those themes come in. So programmable blockchains are a key input into manufacturing financial instruments. So how you make a mutual fund, not how you select the investments per se, but how do you make the mutual fund? How do you make a real estate investment or a commodity investment or a venture investment? There's a whole bunch of themes around blockchain networks powering the packaging of these products. And blockchain networks have some really neat features that are endemic to them. So digital authenticity, digital scarcity. If you think about a digital file today, I can send you the file and you'll have a copy and I'll have a copy. And so we can't have commerce if that's the case, because there's just millions of copies of MP3s and other files on the web. You can't have value, you can't have markets, you can't have economics. And so all of the stories around why blockchain-based assets are valuable come to this point of you can actually have scarce digital assets, you can have mutualized standards, you can have governance and KYC and AML and identity, and all these features around kind of financial services attributes that are really compelling and interesting. There's been a ton of investment in this space, of course, still chasing the killer use case. But if you look at large enterprises, there's now growing from 2,000 engagements in 2018 to about 4,000 engagements in 2019. And so a lot of investment by the industry in this space. You have ongoing activity from large financial incumbents, whether that's JP Morgan creating settlement coins, or whether it's Goldman and Citi doing blockchain equity swaps, or whether it's digital monies and digital euros being issued. So there's the industry thinking about how to adopt this technology. You're starting to see regulators moving forward in helping settlement companies, CSDs, operating various systems that are based on this technology. I'm a little bit of a finance geek, so I apologize for highlighted regulation screenshots. But this stuff is important, and it moves what is possible with the markets. Central banks, whether in the US or in China or in South Africa, 80% of central banks are engaged in thinking about a central bank digital currency. On the right here, you see a screenshot from a Chinese bank app that is holding a digital central bank currency that they've already launched and distributed. So this stuff isn't science fiction, it's already out there. And there's a reimagining of all this financial infrastructure in a digital way. And so programmable blockchains like Ethereum repackage lots and lots of these different industries into what are called protocols. You can see massive growth in these protocols. And so Ethereum today, which is one of the largest assets of that type, has 100 million addresses, which is the equivalent of an account. It has about 500,000 to a million users of these types of products. It has about 15 billion of cash equivalents, so the equivalent of a money market fund, and about 15 billion of underwriting that has gone through it. And so you have this pretty healthy and interesting ecosystem that's called decentralized finance that is manufacturing financial products in a completely novel way, in a way that connects lots of different parties, that uses software written to a different computing paradigm, and that looks a lot like a network that's developing. So the analogy that often comes up is, think about the development of the internet and the specialization and growth of that network over time. And so, here's a comparison of DeFi from last year, and then the complexity of DeFi this year. And of course, the internet was successful when it became inclusive, and when it grew as a network to incorporate lots and lots of different actors. And I would say we're in the very early stages of this. It's a fantastically interesting theme, and I would advise folks not to focus on the kind of the names of the tokens or the coins or the assets, but rather to focus on the underlying technology that is rethinking how financial products are manufactured. Okay, again, easy enough. So what do we talk about? We talked about the journey of financial technology, of unbundling services, making them digital, putting them in a phone, and then bringing back all of those different functionalities, whether they're payments or banking and so on. And we talked about how that's being done by fintech companies and by financial incumbents and by tech firms, and the divide in the East and the West. And then there's the missing piece of the manufacturing of, like, how do you make the thing? And there's now emergent approaches to making that more interesting and more efficient. And so what we'll talk about next starts getting into the science fiction, which is, let's assume that we do have this next generation financial infrastructure. Let's assume that everybody's trained to use fintech apps. What is the next frontier? What are the high-tech firms doing that's interesting, distinctive, and kind of weird? And where is commerce and finance going over the next 10 years in terms of the user experience? And so I mentioned Shopify and Instagram, right? Like, these are communities and they're environments. They're places where people spend a lot of their time, and it's in some sense a virtual world. And so let's talk about virtual worlds and augmented reality and the path of where we shop and where we live. So if you think about the internet, I feel like I should stop and let people digest, but we don't have enough time. We got to do this. This is important. So if you think about what's happened to commerce, it's gone from physical to digital, right? So the screenshot tells you, here's a store that you used to walk through, and now you're going into a digital experience of buying stuff on Amazon. And the next step is taking the digital and re-rendering it as a physical object through a digital interface, right? So this is augmented reality. And I'm going to give a bunch of examples to give people an intuition why this is important and why you should think about the intersection of virtual reality and video gaming worlds and this, like, Zoom environment where we're all kind of rendered avatars, and why that's important. So first off, we now have the software and the hardware to power virtual worlds, right? We're able to render augmented realities in our phones. They are powerful enough with a graphics unit that's able to do it. There's a footprint of something like 1 billion phones that are able to run augmented reality software. Apple is rumored to be releasing augmented reality glasses in the next year or 2 years. So this is a big bet for the large tech companies, because it's a gold rush to offer services in this virtual overlay. And we as human beings and social animals, we attribute the same value to digital objects as we would to physical objects. Now, it's obvious that some physical objects are much more important. Food, getting your kids to school, uh, having a home, right? Like, there are some necessities that I'm assuming are separate from this conversation. When it comes to um, social identity and fulfillment and things that people believe are valuable, digital objects are starting to accrue as much kind of attraction as physical ones. And so if you look at something like Fortnite, which is a game, but really a virtual environment, it generated more than $1 billion of revenue last year. Certainly more than a number of financial institutions. And it had 350 million users. Like, think about social networks. This game, this environment had 350 million users that participated in these different events. And the way that you monetize this is through digital goods that are built in these virtual environments. And you have lots of different communities that are instantiating themselves in virtual realities, whether that is, if you think about Second Life in the early 2000s, you now have 3 million users for something called VRChat. You have a $45 million project, which is called Decentraland, to create a blockchain-based virtual reality sort of world. You have things like Google Earth, right, where you can zoom in and walk through the globe or through cities using virtual reality headsets, right? So communities are anchoring in these rendered worlds, and the financial experiences are actually rendering in these worlds as well. So it's a silly example, maybe it's even an embarrassing example, but on the right you've got a payment processor that is rendering a credit card swipe to purchase a good, and you can see that the rendering is basically a video game interface. We have already invented what an economy looks like in a rendered world, and now it's just a matter of connecting it to our physical one. Another example would be to have an augmented reality shopping experience within an advertising video. So you might be on YouTube, you might have an advertisement that is trying to sell you mascara or makeup, and you can interact with it and project it onto your own face as a filter, and then make a purchasing action literally within that. And so you can see how the sort of the virtual overlay starts to trap the financial experience in it. And similarly, you might project these digital objects in the physical world and have a payment experience on top of that. So, for example, buying furniture on IKEA. You might be a fitness enthusiast, and so you would have a company. You might be using a company like Zwift, which just raised $450 million to build virtual avatars for cyclists in this world, where they have a community and a social experience. And the way that Zwift makes money is by selling personalization, right? They're selling, an ability to participate in this world, and then also a financial aspect about these digital goods. You might have the digitization of commerce, and like you might be shopping at a store, and the physical goods that you're buying using artificial intelligence are being packaged into items on a digital shelf. So what this screen shows you is a consumer looking at purchasing something and interacting with a digital avatar of an ice cream, where the ice cream is like literally right behind the screen. And that can aggregate into completely new shopping experiences. Alibaba in China is a leader in the digitization of retail stores. You can shop through augmented reality. You can use your smile facial recognition to pay for something. You might try things out in a virtual world and make the purchasing experience in a physical world, and then have that be delivered to you by a courier from a completely different warehouse. And so you've got this kind of atomization and recombination of the retail experience into which financial services are embedded. And Amazon is doing the same thing. So in Amazon, you're going to be able to pay with the palm of your hand. You're not going to need to carry a wallet. The image recognition cameras in the ceiling are able to map you and instantiate you in a particular ecosystem, so that the computer essentially creates an avatar of you and of the goods that you buy, and that interaction is rendered entirely sort of outside of the physical environment. Easy enough. Okay, so what did we come to from there? We came to the idea that not only is finance everywhere in our phones, not only is finance going to be manufactured in a new way, in a digital way that's anchored to blockchain networks, but also it's going to extend into these augmented reality virtual worlds. And as we spend more in time in these worlds because we're all at home, and work is remote, and the expectations of how we entertain ourselves change, um, more and more commercial activity and financial activity is going to attach itself into um, these rendered environments and meld together technology, media, and finance. And so that'll land me on my last section, which will be even more fantastical, which is to talk about artificial intelligence and the characters that will inhabit these worlds along with us. And I can talk a lot about artificial intelligence and its use in finance, how to minimize fraud or how to underwrite better. And there's a ton of things that AI is doing within financial services. When you purchase something from Alexa, right, that's an interaction with an AI um, that has a finance thing built into it. If you had investment choices or banking choices within a conversational interface, that's all connected. But I think that's somewhat straightforward. That's another way of distribution. What's interesting to me is, we talked about these virtual worlds. Um, are there AIs that can populate these digital systems? And if your answer is that's really silly, what's the point of that? We can talk about some of these examples, right? So there's an Instagram influencer with about 3 million followers, who's also got a bunch of hit records, Little Michaela, and she's entirely constructed, not a real person. She's a rendered person who has real impact in the world, real commercial impact in the world. We might talk about in China, the AI representations of news anchors that you see on the right, completely rendered person that um, is it's not a physical person, right? It's a um, sort of an image that can be made to say whatever it is and appears human and can drive any agenda. And the language can be manufactured by the machine. Or you can look at the faces of the people on the screen and say, who are these faces? And in fact, they're not faces of anybody. They're just a mathematical hallucination in a space between a whole bunch of photos that Google scanned that can generate new faces that appear realistic to our eyes. And so there are already symptoms of us interacting um, with non-real actors, or with machine actors. And I think this is something that we need to watch out for and think about. And you can say, well, whatever, that doesn't matter. They're not like us. They can't make art. They can't make poetry. And so here are some examples of art that artificial intelligences can make. On the left is a project called Deep Dream, which came out of Google's machine vision efforts around 2016, I believe, which hallucinates various images into photos. On the right is a project driven by adversarial neural networks, which is able to mathematically travel the space between different types of things. So what's the mathematical blend between a fish and a television? And so it's able to generate these images, these beautiful renderings that answer that question. So the next question is, can they write poetry? And so there's a project called GPT-3, which was asked to generate a poem written by Dr. Seuss about Elon Musk. And this is a project from OpenAI that is scanning billions of internet pages in order to generate a conversational interface that sounds very realistic to a human. Similarly, the same trick can be done for music. You can see on the right the schematic for how this works from the same OpenAI group. And then the question is, okay, well, let's say there are these creative artificial intelligences that we can't tell apart from everybody else. Are we going to have commerce with them? Are we going to transact with them? And here I give you an example of a company called Rarible, which today allows for the packaging of digital tokens in a marketplace that can be exchanged. So you don't know who your counterparty is. Your counterparty can be somebody like me, or it can be the artificial intelligence agent that is doing this to to generate commerce. And similarly, this stuff has value, right? It plugs into our decentralized finance systems. It plugs into and integrates into the fintech footprints, and eventually is going to be something that we all see as fairly routine. And the fun thing is, all of this stuff is actually already here. So we can see the examples of some of these early versions of ecosystems and actors out there already. So on the left, I've got the visualization of the various Twitter bots that are trying to influence very timely the election. They're able to generate a message, they're able to connect to a network, they're able to create social proof. And so we already, on a daily basis, interact with lots and lots of machines who are trying to influence our behavior. And on the right, another example is pretty much the same, just in high frequency trading. So if you are trading in the markets, it's very likely that the market making for those trades is coming from high frequency trading firms who are generating trades in order to influence various prices and create market structure. And so even though the things I've described are very much science fiction, when they get implemented in our lives, they feel very normal. They feel like they're not even a surprise. Like it's not even a surprise that we use the image of our face to authenticate into the iPhone to then authenticate into our bank or investment account. And so I think there's a really interesting journey that we're all gonna go through shortly. So that was a lot, and it was super dense. Again, to condense the story into sort of the top level is we've been on this really interesting fintech journey, and it's been primarily about putting financial services into a mobile experience, into a web experience. And the next generation from that is going to be about what kinds of products live in that mobile experience. And they're going to be much more esoteric products on a different financial infrastructure. And as that happens, the high-tech firms are going to deliver new platforms, new worlds that are appropriate to a digitally first culture in the way that we're living it now. And as we enter those worlds and start building real commerce in them, we're going to encounter some pretty strange and interesting actors, many of whom themselves will be machines, and we have to be thoughtful about our assets, the investments that we make, and generally speaking, what it is that we do and how we take care of ourselves.
All right, Lex.
Yeah.
That was a lot, and you did it in an amazingly short amount of time. We actually do have a bunch of questions from the audience, but I'll just remind our viewers right now, again, if you do have questions, go ahead and type them out in the chat box on YouTube or in the comments in LinkedIn and Facebook. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. So first up, we've got a question about regulation. How does regulation play a role in the blending of technology and financial services? Is it a risk for those newer companies that are already in existence and are already doing it as the US tries to catch up with our counterparts overseas?
It's a great question, and it's at the core of what's possible. And I think you kind of have to think about it at different levels, at different macro levels. So for some geographies, uh, innovation is a sword. It's a way to compete globally. And so the reason we see within China such a deep investment on blockchain infrastructure and central bank digital currencies, and such a deep national investment on artificial intelligence and trying to outcompete the US on artificial intelligence, and therefore all this stuff about TikTok having geopolitical implications, is because this investment in the next gen tech allows you to leapfrog. And it doesn't make sense to compete directly. It only makes sense to compete at the edge where you could be strongest. I think the US has really strong regulators that favor both consumer protection, but also favor the treatment of financial products as these separate categories. So investments under the SEC and the Securities Act, banking under the OCC, commodities and derivatives under the CFTC, and then also every single state has a point of view on every single permutation of this question. And then also, God forbid you also do payments, because then you're touching payments regulation, and it becomes increasingly prohibitive to be far outside the box. And if that's the case, you're going to get innovation from two places. You will get it either from J.P. Morgan and Goldman, because of the largest size innovation budget. And I don't mean to prejudice smaller firms. I think they can be nimble and move fast. But when your competitors 30 times larger, they just outspend you, right? So you either end up with the largest global banks doing this, or you default to the high tech firms. So you rely on Google and Facebook for innovation. And we already know the issues around antitrust and the sort of trades that they've done relative to our privacy and data that are very uncomfortable. And I think this is a real challenge, because the barrier to succeeding in the US at scale for fintech are quite hard. And I think regulation is part of that. But the competition is global. So with particularly decentralized finance, you have developers in South America and in South Africa and in Australia and in London and in Singapore and in the US. And so it creates this global community of people who are building, for whom it's quite difficult, not because of some psychopathy, but just it's literally quite difficult to be compliant. And so I really hope that for the US, it'll become a strategic priority to be a winner in this longer term.
Yeah, it seems like there's many hurdles for the US, but we'll see what happens. Another question: the technology behind all of this sounds amazing, but I think people confuse the technology of blockchain with investing in cryptocurrencies. How can we do a better job of separating this?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think one of the nice things about the story I've told you is I've only showed you things that have already happened. I made some forward-looking statements, but every single example I've given is an example of something that already exists or has happened multiple years ago. So, you know, um, is there a multiverse with 10 million people in it? Yeah, it's called Fortnite, and everybody's 18 years old or younger. Or it's called Roblox, on which something like 100,000 games have been developed by kids for each other. And so these worlds already exist, and they have digital assets in them, and so on. And so again, everything I've kind of walked through already exists. And so when you talk about blockchain, I think it's easy to talk about the assets and the tokens, right? And this is one of the reasons that it's so exciting to people, because you have this kind of lottery feeling to it. It's kind of like Robinhood, why it's fun to trade stocks, and maybe it's not good for you, but it's fun. And in crypto, it's the same. Like the asset might be very volatile, and if you're not taking an asset allocation diversified view to it, if you're doing more than 5 to 10% of your portfolio, you might get in trouble. And that's the easy thing to understand. And I think it's a little bit more difficult to get this point of, well, what if we didn't have Visa, or if Visa was different, or instead of the ACH system for banks, what if we had something else? Or instead of brokerage custodians reconciling gigantic spreadsheets overnight and having lots of breaks and inefficiencies, and your trade's going wrong, what if we had a shared ledger for this, and the software was written in 2020 and not in 1985? And I think it's not as catchy of a message, but I think it's the much deeper message about what the computing paradigm is and how to transform the whole industry. But end of the day, I think the token story goes along with the digital transformation story. You just have to be thoughtful about your exposure.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. I gotta ask though, there's been a lot of banter in the chat box about your T-shirt.
Yeah.
Did you get it? What's the story?
Um, I was going back and forth, like if I had, the consensus T-shirt or not. So this is, I just love this T-shirt. It's a company that helps you run artificial intelligence algorithms in the cloud. And so this is their robot, and I thought it was appropriate to bring to this type of conversation.
Very cool. Well, thanks for the explanation. People are intrigued by it. Another question though from the audience: what are the biggest risks or blind spots that you see in AR becoming a bigger part of our everyday lives?
So AR it's one of the furthest things away. I think of there are themes that are very straightforward if you really pause and look at them, which is robo advice, neobanks, digital lending, things like Square, Cash App, like more and more digital financial activity in our phones is inevitable and fairly obvious. Um, the hard stuff, the more uncertain stuff, is the platform shifts of artificial intelligence, blockchain, and augmented and virtual reality. And I think artificial intelligence is largely a game for the high tech firms because you need such an amazing data set, like the entire internet. And for a Google or um, an Alibaba, the advantage is just massive. I mean, that's where that happens. Um, Blockchain-based innovation is open source, it's community-based, and it's quite accessible. And so I think we see a lot of symptoms of it. And then when you come to augmented reality, you have the largest barriers because not only do you have the technical barrier of making the form factor of interacting with this easy, um, not only do you have the behavioral barrier of people learning or generating the behavior that they want to be in this world, right? So you have to look at the adoption curves of television. People used to watch 6 hours of television a day. The adoption curves of the internet. How much time do you spend on the internet per day? So how long will it take for the same adoption curve to occur in augmented reality? And that behavioral change is hard. And then third is the content for things in that virtual world to be interesting and worthwhile, and not just a toy in the narrow sense. It also will take a lot of bootstrapping. So it's hard for me to say. Um, my intuition is that that's going to take the longest amount of time, um, whether it's a decade, less or more. Um, but it's premised on the same technology that makes a self-driving car work. For AR, you need facial recognition and large data sets and graphics processing. And so we're going to see kind of this clunking move forward between um, self-driving cars and the Internet of Things, like artificial intelligence processing hardware and AR, all of that happening together. And as the generations shift, I think we're going to see more and more adoption.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As far out as 10 years.
It's a hard question. It's hard.
Yeah, I definitely think it is. How do the banks play a role in this? Do they partner with fintechs, or do they acquire them? What's the path forward for them in
Yeah.
fintech? We only have about a minute, so
I think the relationship between fintechs and the banks is at this point fairly straightforward. The banks have more scale, and I think fairly conclusively in most places the financial incumbents won. I think fintechs provide a nice consumer footprint, but the banks are able to match that footprint and um, often acquire companies, especially when they're in distress. And so I think there is going to be a much more cohesive partnerships between the fintech experience and the banking experience, and it'll be one and the same. The real things at the edges that are kind of the danger to the banks is their position relative to the high tech firms. And just as an example, Deutsche Bank is worth about 15 or 20 billion these days. Apple is worth about 2 trillion and has 250 billion of cash on its balance sheet. So I think that just gives you the relative power of these different market players. So we'll see how that works out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point and great way to put it into perspective for sure. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us today, Lex. We really appreciate it. I think our viewers really enjoyed the presentation. Quickly though, how can people get in touch with you if they're interested, or your website, or what?
Absolutely. I try to make myself easy to find. If you just Google Lex Sokolin, you'll end up either Lex Sokolin, the Twitter, or on my LinkedIn. I've got a newsletter that talks about these themes, and I do kind of a lot of activity with the community. And then for Consensus, check out consensus.net. It opens up a lot of these themes around financial manufacturing, and really, I think will be interesting both for people looking at blockchain assets as well as blockchain technology.